problem arose. Okay, ask about the fundamental versus proximal channels of development. This is very important. Huh? So we began as a profession, development economists began to distinguish between fundamental versus proximal channels of development. What do I mean by this? Let's say that someone asked you, why did the Titanic sink? One person could answer that, well, because it hit, there was a hole in the water line. Is that an answer? Of course it is. That describes the mechanics of the process, right? Indeed, there was a hole in the water line, and that's how the mechanics played themselves out. But someone could then ask, why was there a hole in the water line? And you would then overdetermined result, all the forces acting at once that produces the joint result. So my first critique of the way they're thinking about this project is to think about an essentialist cause that is independent of others. Because we know from experience, for example, that you cannot deduce, even from the geography, for example, that if I told you that there's this place, it's a desert, would it be developed or underdeveloped? You cannot deduce from that fact alone whether this place, whether that I'm talking about is Las Vegas, Nevada, Dubai, which is also a desertous kind of a place, or the Thar Desert in Pakistan or India, right? It depends on the other factors. Similarly, if I gave you a certain settler mortality rate, as in Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, can I predict what the future outcomes of a country would be? Now, it is interesting for us as Pakistani people to ask that question. Because growing up, the first question that I asked as soon as I read this paper by Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson way back in 2007 was that my country has the same settler mortality rate as the neighboring country of India. In particular, if I zoom into my province, which is where I was born, i.e. Punjab, which was partitioned between Indian Punjab and Pakistani Punjab, we had an identical geography, identical colonial history, right? In other words, both the factors were common in our case, and yet we have divergence. That leads me to the view that what Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, as well as the geography school, are missing is the precise fact that developing countries are not prisoners of birth. Notice, for those of you who are inclined towards econometrics, for example, both these two variables, institutions as well as geography, are time invariant variables. I can't change the geography of my country. Right? Similarly, I can't go back in time. I don't have access to a time machine so that I can go back and change the settler mortality rate in the past. Okay. Okay. So that's the first problem. It's a methodological problem to begin with. It's a three premises. It's right there in their paper. They describe it literally. They literally call it the three premises. Step one of the argument is that European colonizers went to the world and established two kinds of institutions. That's step one of the argument. The British, the French, the Dutch, the Portuguese went to different parts of the world, Africa, Asia, Latin America, Australia, blah, blah, blah. And they established two different kinds of institutions. That's an excellent question, Nadeem. I'll return to that in a moment. What I'm talking about is the settler mortality rate of Acemoglu. Institutions can change, and I'll return to that in a moment. So premise one of Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson is that there's two different kinds of colonialisms. One of them is what they call, believe it or not, extractive institutions. Extractive institutions. Now that leads me to the view that the other one is going to be non-extractive, right? And it is, that's what they call it. They call it inclusive. Now let me remind you, for those of you who are interested in history, this is what they mean. When they're referring to the inclusive institution, what they mean is the institutions that arose after there was a genocide of Aboriginal people in Australia and a genocide of Native American people in North America, as we know from real history, right? As there was a genocide and apartheid regime in South Africa until 1994. The word apartheid literally, you know that South Africa was a settler colony, and the word apartheid literally means to separate, to segregate, to create exclusiveness. In Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson's mind, the genocide of Aboriginal Australians and the genocide of Native Americans is reminiscent of inclusive institutions. And Africa, Asia, and Latin America, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Congo, Kenya, etc., those places are extractive. Okay, very good. Step 3. Now the question arises, in their theory, what determines whether the Europeans would establish extractive institutions or quote unquote inclusive institutions? Please remember that this is a linguistic spin. When I say inclusive institutions, I'm not being blind to the genocide of Aboriginal Australians and Native Americans. That's what Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson are doing. So in their mind, the property rights regime and historical institutions set up after the genocide of Australian Aboriginal people are the good institutions. Please keep that in mind as we proceed. Okay. Now, step 3 of the argument is, well, you ask what determines whether Europeans wanted to establish good institutions or bad institutions. And their answer is the settler mortality rate. Settler mortality rate. What does that mean? That's basically what they're saying is the following. I'm going to exaggerate a little bit because it's entertaining this way. So when the Europeans went to particular places, they looked at the geography and they asked the following question: is the disease and climate environment conducive to my settlement, i.e. the European settlement? And if the answer were yes, they said, okay, we'll settle here and we'll create good institutions. And if the answer was no, I hate this weather, it's really hot in Lahore, I'm going to create extractive institutions. You see the story here? Now, depending on the disease environment, that's Acemoglu's story, the settlers decided whether they wanted to settle or not. And this decision in turn had an impact on the past institutions, which in turn had an inertial impact. That's the word they use, institutional inertia or institutional persistence. These institutions persisted so that, ladies and gentlemen, Pakistan is poor because we have pathetic institutions, right? That's the story. Now let's rewind a little bit. Let's rewind a little bit and let's ask a different question. The first question to ask is whether or not it is actually true that Europeans were deciding whether to settle or not purely on the basis of the climate. One of the major dents that was thrown at Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson comes from a prize-winning paper that was published in the American Economic Review by David Albury. David Albury in 2012. It was always also published in the American Economic Review, where the following happened. David Albury, and this is really interesting. For those of you who like empirical work, you're really going to enjoy this. The original Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson paper from 2001 deployed a data set that goes back to that relies on the historical work of a historian by the name of Philip Curtin. Philip Curtin had written this book called Death by Migration, in 1989. This is just for context. If I'm boring you with too much detail, you can tell me in the comments, huh?
This is
Because
very
I'm a professor,
interesting because you
I
are
have the
actually
habit
taking
of
us to
going into too much detail. Please, ma'am, go ahead.
I'm saying it's not boring at all, and it's like, a trip to all of the book. So while you are saying it, I am actually going on those chapters of the book and I'm memorizing, yes, this happened. So it is basically a refreshing note to why nations fail and, the AJR's theory. So please continue. It's very entertaining. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. So just in case if I'm giving too much detail, please stop me. Huh? Feel free. So I'm just going to say that in the original paper, which was published in 2001 by Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, The Colonial Origins of Comparative Development, they had 64 countries. 64 countries. And they used Philip Curtin's data set to basically come up with what they called the settler mortality rate. Settler mortality rate. This was basically going to be used as an instrumental variable or an IV, instrumental variable, for past institutions, such that the argument was that there is, as you guys know, the instrumental variable technique has to pass through the exclusivity clause, which means that the instrument can only be related to the y variable through the intermediation of x, right? So basically the z variable, our instrumental variable, is like a bridge between y and x, such that only z can connect y and x. There is no other reason to believe that y and x are connected. Okay, so the z variable or the instrumental variable for Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson is settler mortality. Where did they get that from? This is critical, huh? They got it from Philip Curtin's historical book, in which Philip Curtin had looked at, you ready? The death of European soldiers. Now, this is critical. What David Albury did in 2012 is devastating and mortal for the Acemoglu argument. Here's what David Albury did. David Albury partitioned Acemoglu's data into two kinds. He asked, what percentage of the data points actually come from campaigning soldiers and what part of it comes from non-campaigning soldiers? So believe it or not, here's what he found. He found that of the 64 countries in the sample, 42 had data from campaigning soldiers and 22 had data from non-campaigning soldiers. Just pay attention to that for a second, huh? Notice, what difference does it make if I change the word settler to soldier? Notice, soldiers and settlers are two very different kinds of beasts. One is there as a civilian, thinking about whether I should settle in this lovely weather called Lahore or Murray. Whereas a soldier is there to conquer and enslave other people, right? And hence, in places like India, where we had a pre-existing state known as the Mughal Empire, and in Punjab, where we had Raja Ranjit Singh's state from 1797 to 1848, in places like India, which were developed, which had an existing state, and where the indigenous people could offer resistance to the colonizers, the soldier mortality rate was higher. Because as we know from history, Tipu Sultan, Rani of Jhansi, Mangal Pandey, and all of these heroes of our past were waging a war against Bhagat Singh, etc., had never given up and they were resisting colonialism. In places like Australia and in North America, where the poor people, the poor communities, tribal communities, did not have a pre-existing state because they were living in communist kind of tribal conditions. They didn't have a pre-existing state. They were not used to violence. They got wiped out, as we know from history. And what Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson are doing, ladies and gentlemen, is whitewashing settler colonialism. It's whitewashing settler colonialism. I'm on my final point, and then I'm going to stop with my speech because this is boring for you guys.
No, it's
Just
not.
notice and pay attention to their outcome variable. In addition to the input variable, the X variable being horrifying, the Y variable in this context is, believe it or not, the risk of expropriation to capital. Notice that who fares? You see, what are we trying to maximize? When we're trying to maximize the variable or minimize the variable called risk to capital and to foreign capital, are Pakistani or Indian or Mexican or Congolese or Kenyan people going to benefit from the whether ExxonMobil and Nvidia and Microsoft are doing well in those countries or not? It's a question that we should ask. Whether economic development actually means what Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson are suggesting it should mean. Or does it mean something else? Does it mean, as Amartya Sen believes, it means the expansion of human freedom? Because that's what there is another Nobel laureate in this equation who has talked about development as freedom, development as expanding human freedoms. So we really need to ask this question, especially as Pakistani people who have grown up in a former British colony, who lived through the torturous regime, historically torturous regime created by the British that was premised on genocide. Who can forget in India and Pakistan the Jallianwala Bagh incident? Who can forget in North America the genocide of Native Americans? And Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson are literally, as we say in Urdu, rubbing salt in the wounds of African, Asian, Aboriginal, Australian, and Native American people by arguing that there was such a thing as a cozy kind of inclusive capitalism anywhere in the world. The truth of the matter is that capitalism's roots are premised on genocide everywhere. Genocide and slavery is embedded within capitalism. The port that is 3 hours away from me, the port of New York City, was a port where slaves were imported from Africa, stolen from Africa, and brought to this place. And basically, what we call economic development in capitalism is nothing else but the loot and plunder of poor people everywhere. That's my short kind of analysis of this Nobel Prize.
Thank you, Dr. Shahram. A very honest and I don't know if I would be using this word, but a very honest is a better choice of word. A very honest, review, and you have actually helped us to walk through the history while explaining all the roots of AJR theory. So you have drawn when I was reading your work, I found out that you have drawn comparisons between AJR's work and Paul Baran's contributions from the 1950s. So, what would Baran argue are the true factors behind global economic divergence, and how does his view contrast with AJR? If I be more elaborative, in Baran's view, for your all information, the colonialism inherently involved exploitation and resource extraction. So basically, I'm trying to understand your views, that what do you think, incorporating his perspective would change the way we interpret AJR's founding on colonial legacies?
Thank you for that question, Dr. Saiba. I honestly think that we have always needed scholars. By we, I mean people from the former colonized world, needed and always need and still need scholars who tell our story. You know that there's this joke that as long as the hunter keeps telling the story and the lion does not have the voice, every story is going to keep praising the hunter, right? So it's a bit like that in economics as well, that the story is always being told either by the rich man or the white man, right? And it's never being told by the subaltern, by the person for whom economics has to work in the first place. So fortunately for us, there have been in the past and still are genuine, authentic scholars like Paul Baran and Samir Amin, this guy from Egypt, a very similar economy to ours, who had the ability to challenge imperialism and call it for what it is, right? So Paul Baran wrote this seminal text in 1956-57. He was from Stanford University. He was the only tenured Marxist professor at Stanford at the time. He died in the 1960s at a very young age. But Paul Baran wrote this amazing book called The Political Economy of Growth. The Political Economy of Growth. To remind you and your audience members, economics underwent a very major transformation after World War II. Because think about it, all of us are social scientists or think about this particular problem seriously. Notice that what has happened in the 1940s and 50s, soon on after World War II, is that a number of new countries have suddenly been, new countries have suddenly emerged on the world map. Huh? So, for example, we won our independence in 1947, China in 1949, so on and so forth, right? So throughout the 1940s and 50s, there was a period of at least formal decolonization. Okay, so now Paul Baran is one of those few economists who began to pose this question as such. Because think about it, for standard economics, which was developed in the rich capitalist countries, where we have developed credit markets and blah, 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 the economics that was developed had a very different foundation than the actual economies that we had inherited in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So Paul Baran began to ask the question in the right terms. So he asked the following question: what shapes economic development in the long run? What is the proximal mechanism? And he discovered, as we have elsewhere, that the proximal mechanism is the economic surplus. What does that mean? It's the difference between the output and your consumption, right? You produce a certain output and you consume a certain amount of it. The remainder is the surplus, which can be used for reinvestment and hence growth, right? Okay, so that's the idea. So Paul Baran now pointed out that the reason why Africa, Asia, and Latin America were poor is the most obvious reason that every Tom, Dick, and Harry should know if he had or she had a basic understanding of history, namely that India is poor because England is rich. Indonesia is poor because Holland is rich. Congo is poor because Belgium is rich. It's the dialectic of wealth and poverty. When you steal other people's wealth and you siphon it off, and your queen wears with pride the diamond that was stolen from Indian people without any reparations and without feeling any remorse or shame, right? It is the siphoning of the surplus. It's as simple as that. You steal other people's wealth, it's a rather good facility to have. If India, China, and Pakistan and Bangladesh could steal France's wealth, right, they would also become rich countries. It's a fairly easy way of becoming rich. Steal other people's wealth, colonize them, enslave them. Okay, Paul Baran was sensitive to that real history. He didn't want to tell some fantastical ideological story. You know that in economics, we have this way of thinking about the world in which we start with the perfect consumer and then look at the real one. We start with the perfect competition world, and then we look at the real world as a deviation from the... It's like trying to understand the horse by looking at the unicorn, right? Right? It's a bit like that. Instead, Paul Baran and Marxist economists then and now have believed that you should always start with the real premises. Start with the real world as it is and try to develop mental categories that correspond to that. Instead of starting with transitive preferences, axioms of revealed preference, instead of starting with that kind of stupid ideological exercise, why not start with the real world and develop our analyses in correspondence with it? That's what Paul Baran did. Paul Baran developed an analysis that the reason why poor countries were poor had to do with real history, i.e., colonization, slavery, loot, plunder. As simple as that. You have to be a liar to tell a different story. Honestly, you have to be either extremely delusional or ignorant of history to say otherwise, because it's literally, if you go to think about any African Asian country in the world, think about even the countries that are doing well these days, like Vietnam, for example, is expanding its exports and all the rest of it. It's doing well in terms of standard kind of neoclassical growth stories, right? But even think about that country. Remember what Ho Chi Minh said. He said that liberty, equality, and fraternity were great in Paris, but they didn't seem to work in Hanoi. Similarly, people in Pakistan and India and Bangladesh know that these ideas of and liberal virtues of democracy and sipping on your tea and talking about the lovely weather is a British virtue which works in London, but that facility was never extended to uh, the working classes and the working masses of India, Pakistan, right? It never was. So now Paul Baran was inviting us to consider the following. He was saying, by the way, and I firmly believe that Archimoglu, Johnson, and Robinson have literally taken, notice I didn't use the word plagiarize because of various reasons. They took various parts of Baran's argument as it is and diverged with him in step three. You remember this story I told you earlier of the three premises? Those three premises are identical in Baran, except in step three, where Baran says that the settler decided where to settle and where not to settle, depending on the level of resistance provided by the indigenous people, right? As you know, in in Australia, New Zealand, and in North America, owing to reasons of um, the fact that those communities did not have violent means, as typically communities do not have, communities which have not developed a state. For example, even in our case, the Indus Valley civilization did not have violent instruments. They've never been discovered because those people didn't need war. Warfare is the need of societies which have developed class antagonisms, right? So let's take some interesting questions
I
from
guess
the.
I was also thinking the same that since okay, to be very honest, I had like a list of questions and a list of debates, that we really wanted to go on. But the discussion is so interesting and we are so short of time that we have to, conclude, and it is more important to take your questions. So I think with the permission of Dr. Shahram, we will move to questions.
Absolutely.
And let's
I
start
would love
with
that.
Muhammad Nadeem Sarwar, who asked the question at first place. So please, if you would like to open your mic.
Assalamu alaikum. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so basically I have a lot more than I have around 4 questions, but let me know how many I can ask, because you already mentioned the time limitation, and I do understand that exactly the time is limited, and I'm thankful to the speaker for his
Um,
good talk.
Sir, among those 4 questions, which one is your most favorite question? Let's choose.
Okay, so you want to ask? Okay. So I should pick one question. Then my question is that what I got from your talk is that the institutions were not developed because of the weather conditions that are suitable for rural English class, or mm, but you say that you agree more to the theory that it was because of the resistance offered by the inhabitants. Okay, that may be the reason for creating the kind of institution, but my question is, if we leave aside the intention behind creating the kind of the institutions, then does the kind of institutions finally created not matter for the outcome? And just to explain my question more in more detail, like we see the wealth between the difference of growth in per capita income between Pakistani Punjab and Indian Punjab. Before 1990s, Pakistani Punjab was doing much better. Here, the per capita income growth rates was much higher. But we see a clear change in the institutional setup in India in 1990. And from then onward, we see that there has been the reversal of it. That is now Indian Punjab per capita income is growing at a higher rate. Same happened in China. Poverty of China in past may be explained by the loot of the West. But what explains the prosperity of China, especially in last 3 decades, if not institutions? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That's a really, really, really poignant and really nuanced kind of amazing question. Thank you very much for that. So I just kind of wanted to say 2 things. The first is that your first question is really interesting. It is that what difference does it make whether the motivation was premised in the weather or climate reasons, as in Acemoglu's argument, or whether it is, as in Baran's case, because of violence. Now, here's why it changes everything. You see, the settler mortality rate, or I can call it the soldier mortality rate, that's my view, and Albui's view, by the way. Now, notice that how you construct an instrument in an instrumental variable technique has an impact on your theory. Acemoglu's theory is that the only way this instrumental variable from the past can be connected to the present, i.e. GDP in the present era, is through the mediation of institutions, past institutions and current institutions. But notice that if we say that it is because of conflict and violence in the past, now we have a different conflict-ridden story. Now we have a story that explains why all the former colonies from Africa to Asia, including our country, experience so much internal civil war and conflict, because the institutions are premised on conflict, right? And all kinds of weird tribal identity-based conflicts. So in other words, it is exactly what the colonized people experienced, i.e. divide and rule. You divide people along the lines of tribe, race, ethnicity, caste, and then you rule them by dividing them into these groups. So what we inherited then, so we have a difference. So how does the intention change? The intention changes the outcome, because the intention here was managing difference and managing political difference. Why? Because you couldn't kill everyone. In places where you wiped out the entire population, you didn't have that particular logistical problem. So it was a governmental problem from the standpoint of the European who wanted to minimize the risk of his investments. Let me remind you that many liberals in our part of the world celebrate कि जी गोरों ने हमें ये ट्रेनें बना के दी थी, right? It's a thing that we say. We like to believe, we like to hate on ourselves and our ancestors, right? And we like to believe that, the point is that the East India Company had listed shares on the London stock market, which had a guaranteed rate of return of 30% to anyone who bought these shares in the railways. Now, what I wanted to point out then is that the goal was always, it was never a development anywhere in the world. It was not development in Australia, not development in North America, and not development in India and Pakistan. The goal was the enrichment of the few, the rich who became richer as a result of colonialism everywhere. And that has an impact on the present, because notice that now we have a very different demand now. Now we're not demanding, as Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson say, security of private property. Giving a cozy environment to foreign capital. No, we're demanding reparations. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh should get together and demand reparations from England. Indonesia should demand reparations from Holland. Because think about it, when other people have had the facility of colonizing you for 200 years, it follows then that as soon as the Pakistani policymaker starts designing the budget for the year, 50% of that has to go to the former colonizers, right? So as a policymaker, even if the best person, right, even if Albert Einstein is the finance minister of Pakistan with the best heart and the best intentions, he can't do anything. Why? Because you need money to do something. Where is the money? We have to pay it back to the people who colonized us. So The story changes as a result of how we think about it. And finally, just briefly, your question is very interesting, that if we compare Indian and Pakistani Punjab or China, for example, a former colony which actually did something. I would just add, for example, South Korea to this story. South Korea, Vietnam, these are countries that are actually doing something interesting, like in terms of they inherited bad institutions, but they're doing something, right? Whether that something is great or not is a different question, but it's slightly better than us, at the very least, than Pakistan, right? And the answer is very simple, Dr. Sarwar. The answer is that it has to do with the state's policy. It has to do with what the state does. Now, notice in India, in the 1950s, the Nehru government established IITs, the Indian Institute of Technology, everywhere. These were modeled around MIT and all the rest of it. And notice that all the technical revolution that's taking place in India today, and the fact that Microsoft wants to hire Indian people and blah, 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 right, has to do with the state's investment in that sector. The same with the fact that the state in Punjab conducted a massive land reform in India. The maximum area that you could own, I'm forgetting the exact number, it was 20 or 25 acres in India, whereas for us, you know the story. Now, as a result, what happens is that people might say that what difference does it make what the size of the land is and blah, 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 right? But it makes a lot of difference to the incentives. We're economists and we're all about incentives. And if the small landowner, for example, because of parceling of land, does not have the incentive to invest in technical change, they will not invest in technical change. Similarly, we know that there are synergies between inputs. In the Indian Punjab, tube wells, electricity was free. It still is probably for agricultural sector. Now imagine that if I told a Pakistani farmer that, your electricity is going to be free, use tube wells freely. Imagine the kind of productivity enhancements we could have. But those will not happen because the people in charge of Pakistani Punjab are the former landlords, the sugar mafia, and the people. Think about it for a second. We're growing this stupid crop called cotton, called sugar, which is bad for our environment. It's bad for our health. 30% of Pakistanis suffer from diabetes because of this stupid crop. It does nothing for our health. Why are we producing it? Think about it. So these are all questions that immediately emerge as soon as we start thinking about the ruling bloc and ruling classes. And absolutely, Dr. Saab, no one is stopping us from changing the institutions. And that is exactly what we should be thinking about. That the generation that has inherited, as I said, my father was born on the day of independence. But they had a certain set of ideas. I respect their ideas, but that generation could not do what it dreamt of doing. So it follows then that once we understand that you and I have inherited genocidal, violent institutions from our British colonizers, we'll understand a number of things. Firstly, we'll understand that India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, people who are from the same kind of historical past, have to form alliances with one another. We're brothers and sisters ultimately, who were divided by the British to achieve their own objectives, and those objectives were achieved, right? We are living through hell in South Asia. Why? Because the Brits did extremely well at doing what they did, right? So we have to understand that peace is also an institution. Peace is also an institution. And without peace, which is what we've been craving for 200 years, why are we craving for it? Well, because unlike the American revolutionaries who defeated the British in 1776, our ancestors lost the War of 1857, and hence we live through this miserable kind of post-colonial ruling class structure. So the answer to the question is we have to organize people on the basis of exactly what Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth, the people who are absolute losers in the system, the people who get absolutely nothing. They got absolutely nothing from British colonialism. They got absolutely nothing from the post-colonial state. They got absolutely nothing from the private sector or the public sector in Pakistan. The wretched of the earth, the people who, Sir Arthur Lewis called surplus labor, the people who basically are the wretched of the earth in every sense of the term. Absolutely. Internal institutions based on our own historical, cultural past. You know that one also has to revisit what we've encountered in our Pakistan studies books. Because notice, when we studied that, there was this impression as if our ancestors were these illiterate, ignorant people who were resisting British education, right? Now, you remember this? For everyone who's been through Pakistan studies, you remember this lesson, right? That the ancestors of Muslims were these beastly kind of ignorant people who did not want education. Now, it begs the question, one should just sit back and ask the following question: how was Mirza Ghalib born? Where did Mir Taqi Mir come from? If all of these people were ignorant beasts, how were we producing Birbal? How were we producing Mir Taqi Mir? How were we producing Akbar Allahabadi? Were these being trained by God? Of course not. There were educational. And secondly, why were the Muslims resisting the war, the British in 1857? Was it just because they were ignorant people and didn't know about their own? Notice that development can and is still being used as an excuse for dictatorship, as an excuse for making people silent. Arturo Escobar, this development critic, rightly pointed out that, often, as in Chile, for example, violence is still used as a pretext by the ruling classes to say that, look, we're developing and everyone else should just be silent.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shahram, for your very thought-provoking critique of 2024 Nobel Prize work. And particularly your discussion was, let me say, very eye-opening. Particularly, we understood the basic assumptions, or the simplified model of inclusive and extractive institutions that in a very fancy world would lead to the prosperous nation. So we actually examined the assumptions behind these models, and particularly you enlightened us on the historical context that might be, you can say, overlooked in the mainstream economic frameworks. Thank you so much again for your time. We have Dr. Ghulam Ghouse with us, who is the founder of NextGen, and currently he is associated with Beacon House National University. And Dr. Ghulam Ghouse, are you here with us?
Yes, Dr. Aribah.
Sir, I would request you to please conclude our session. And thank you so much again, Dr. Shahram, for your time and your wonderful lecture. Yes.
First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Shahram, for your time. Basically, we know that your time is so precious and so kind of you for giving us few moments from your busy time. Basically, today I was discussing with my student the quantity theory of money, and the Fisher is of view that the velocity of money is determined by the institution within an economy that affects the way in which the individual conduct transactions. So, and today's session is also on institution. That is why it's a very, you can say that similar topic. But as we know that the institutions from last many years, we are facing so many problems in that particular region where we are nowadays. The institutions are not working properly, as we know that. I'm not expert of institution. Dr. Aribah has for my knowledge on institution, but according to my understanding, that your session is a very wonderful session. Indeed, in this session, you provide a very knowledgeable thoughts, and some ideas for the betterment of the institution, how we can work and how we can make some changes to make some betterment for our institution. So thank you so much, Dr. Shahram, for this thought-provoking critique of the 2024 Nobel Prize work.
Thank you,
It's
sir.
been eye-opening to see the assumption behind these models and broader historical context that might be overlooking mainstream economic framework. Thank you everyone who joined us today, student, faculty, and guests. I hope this session has sparked a new perspectives on economic history and the impact of institution on global development. Here at the University of Lahore, even though from my university, Bikaner National University, we remain committed to fostering critical discussion like this one. And Dr. Sharam, we have a very distinguished, you can say that a very prominent institutional expert, Dr. Akmal Hussain, and we will try our best to arrange a seminar with Dr. Akmal Hussain and you, and inshallah, we'll try our
उस्तादों के
best.
उस्ताद हैं वो तो.
Yes. So we remain committed to fostering basically critical discussions like this one, and I look forward to many more opportunities for all of us to engage, challenge, and learn together. We wish Dr. Sharam continued success in his work and thanks him for sharing this insightful ideas with us today. Thank you so much, Dr. Shah. Now, Dr. Aribah, up to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ghouse. Thank you again, Dr. Shahram. We are highly obliged for your time. Thank you, everybody. Signing off for today. The post discussion material, which includes a recording and my prepared notes of the summary of this today's discussion, as well as if you are interested in the very famous book of Why Nations Fail, I will give you the PDF copy as well, and the lecture slides that he has given at Harvard University. I'll share that with you as well, and their seminal research paper as well. So the readings would be shared in our WhatsApp NextGen group. Please stay connected with our NextGen research, training, and consultancy. This is Dr. Aribah, co-founder NextGen, signing off for today. Have a very good night. Allah Hafiz.